I want you to stop for a moment and think about someone you love. Maybe it's a parent who started repeating themselves at dinner. Maybe it's a friend who couldn't remember a name they've known for 30 years. Or maybe, if you're being honest with yourself, it's you. A word that slipped away. A room you walked into and stood in, confused, for just a second too long, and you told yourself it was nothing. Just tiredness, just age. But somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet fear settled in. And that fear has a name, and you've probably never said it out loud. I'm Dr. William, a functional medicine doctor with over 2 decades of clinical experience working specifically with adults in their 60s, 70s, and beyond. And today I want to talk to you not about what you should be afraid of, but about what the latest neuroscience is quietly confirming, that the brain, even at 75, even at 80, has a capacity to protect itself, to repair itself, and in many documented cases, to measurably recover function that people assumed was simply gone. What I'm going to share with you today are 5 specific protectors, 5 things backed by peer-reviewed research that have shown a genuine measurable ability to shield your brain from the kind of decline most people believe is inevitable. And I want to tell you right now, before we go any further, that nothing on this list requires a prescription. Nothing requires an expensive supplement or a complicated protocol. What it requires is understanding, and that is exactly what we're going to build together today. Before we begin, I want to ask you something personally. Drop your age in the comments right now. Are you in your 60s, 70s, or 80s? And tell me, is there someone in your life whose memory decline you've watched and quietly feared for yourself? I read every single comment on this channel, every one, because this isn't a broadcast. This is a conversation. And the people in this community show up every week because they refuse to accept that decline is the only story available to them. So tell me where you are, and let's get into this together. We're going to count down from 5 to 1, and I want you to stay until the end because number 1 is the protector that produces the most dramatic results in my clinical practice, and it is almost certainly the one you've thought about the least. The further we go down this list, the more transformative the science becomes. Let's begin. Number 5 is something so ordinary, so woven into daily life, that most people will hear it and feel a small flicker of disappointment. They'll think, that can't possibly be enough. And that reaction, that instinct to dismiss the simple thing is exactly why so many people miss it. We're talking about social connection, specifically meaningful, regular, reciprocal conversation with people you care about. I know it sounds like advice from a greeting card, but let me tell you what's actually happening in the brain when genuine connection occurs, because the neuroscience here is genuinely extraordinary. When you engage in real conversation, not passive television watching, not scrolling, but actual back and forth dialogue with another human being, your brain activates a cascade of neurochemical events. Oxytocin is released, which reduces cortisol, your primary stress hormone. And this matters enormously for brain health because chronically elevated cortisol is one of the most well-documented drivers of hippocampal shrinkage. The hippocampus is the brain region most directly responsible for forming and retrieving memories. It is the first structure visibly damaged in Alzheimer's disease. Cortisol, sustained over months and years, physically erodes it. Meaningful social connection is one of the few things proven to keep cortisol in check consistently over time. A landmark study from the Rush Memory and Aging Project, following over 900 older adults for an average of 5 years, found that those with the highest levels of social engagement experienced cognitive decline at a rate 50% slower than those who were the most isolated. 50%. That is not a marginal difference. That is the difference between a person who remains sharp and independent at 80 and one who requires full-time care. And researchers at Harvard, through their study of adult development, one of the longest studies of human happiness and health ever conducted, found that the quality of relationships in midlife was a stronger predictor of cognitive health in late life than cholesterol levels, blood pressure, or even genetic risk factors. I had a patient named Dorothy, a 71-year-old retired librarian from Raleigh, North Carolina. She came to me following the death of her husband of 44 years. In the 18 months after his passing, she had become almost entirely socially withdrawn. She was eating well, she was taking her medications, she was doing everything her primary care physician had told her to do. But she was alone most days and she knew something was shifting. Her recall was slower. She was losing words mid-sentence. She felt, as she described it, like the lights were dimming. We didn't start with supplements or complex protocols. We started with structure. 2 phone calls per week with her daughter, a Thursday morning walking group at her local community center, a monthly book club she'd been putting off joining for 2 years. Within 4 months, Dorothy told me something I will never forget. She said, "I feel like I'm coming back to myself." Her processing speed on cognitive assessments improved measurably over 6 months, not because of anything exotic, but because her brain was being used, being stimulated, being bathed in the neurochemical environment that human connection consistently produces. Your brain was not designed for isolation, it was designed for relationship. And every week you spend primarily alone is a week your hippocampus is operating under unnecessary threat. The practical guidance here is simple, but it requires intention. Schedule social contact the way you schedule a doctor's appointment. Put it in your calendar. Protect it. Aim for at least 3 meaningful conversations per week. And by meaningful, I mean conversations where you are genuinely engaged, where you are listening and responding and feeling something. Passive proximity to other people, sitting in the same room without real engagement, does not produce the same neurochemical effect. Quality is what matters here. And your synergy tip for number 5 is this: combine social contact with light physical activity whenever possible. A walk with a friend, a gentle yoga class, a garden club. Research from the University of British Columbia found that social physical activity produced 2.5 times greater cognitive benefit than either social contact or physical activity alone. The brain responds to combination. It always has. Number 4 is going to surprise you, and I say that having watched the expressions on patients' faces when I explain it in the office. Most people, when they think about protecting their brain, think about what they eat, what they take, how they exercise. Almost no one thinks about what they learn. I'm talking about novelty learning, specifically the deliberate, regular acquisition of genuinely new skills, not review, not repetition of things you already know, but real learning of something your brain has never done before. Here's the mechanism, and it is one of the most beautiful things I know about the human brain. Your brain at any age retains the capacity for neuroplasticity. That is the ability to form new neural connections, to physically reshape its own architecture in response to new experience. For decades, scientists believed this capacity was largely fixed after young adulthood. We now know that is wrong. A process called experience-dependent neuroplasticity continues throughout the entire lifespan. But, and this is critical, it requires genuine challenge. It requires the brain to encounter something it does not already know how to do. When you learn a new skill, something with real complexity, a new language, a musical instrument, a new form of craft or art, a new technology, your brain does something remarkable. It builds new synaptic connections, it strengthens existing pathways, and it increases what neuroscientists call cognitive reserve. Think of cognitive reserve as your brain's savings account. The more connections you build over a lifetime, the more reserve you accumulate, and the more reserve you have, the longer your brain can sustain function, even if damage from aging or disease begins to occur. People with high cognitive reserve have been shown in autopsy studies to have had significant Alzheimer's pathology in their brain tissue, amyloid plaques, tau tangles, the physical hallmarks of the disease, yet showed little to no clinical symptoms during their lifetime. Their reserve compensated. Their savings account was deep enough to absorb the loss. Research from the University of Edinburgh found that adults over 60 who regularly engaged in high-complexity learning activities had significantly greater white matter integrity. That's the quality of the connective tissue between brain regions, compared to those who engaged primarily in familiar, low-demand activities. And a study published in Psychological Science found that learning a new skill like digital photography or quilting for just 15 hours per week over 3 months produced memory improvements comparable to those seen in much younger adults. I think about a patient of mine named George, a 73-year-old retired civil engineer from Columbus, Ohio, who came to me concerned about his recall. He was intellectually active in his reading, but everything he was reading was within his existing areas of expertise. His brain was comfortable. We discussed the concept of productive difficulty, the idea that the brain strengthens most when it struggles. He was skeptical. Engineers often are, but he agreed to try something completely outside his experience. He chose to learn classical guitar. 6 months later, his working memory scores had improved by 22% on standardized assessment. More importantly, he told me he felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. That feeling is not incidental. It is the sensation of a brain being asked to grow and responding. The practical application here is deliberate. Choose one genuinely new skill and commit to it for a minimum of 3 months. It must be something your brain cannot currently do well. The discomfort you feel at the beginning, the frustration, the sense of being a beginner, that feeling is neuroplasticity. That is your brain building new architecture. Do not avoid it. Seek it. And pair your novelty learning with the social connection from number 5 whenever possible, a language class, a music group, a pottery workshop, because the research consistently shows that learning in social context deepens encoding and accelerates skill acquisition. Number 3 is where the science becomes genuinely extraordinary. And I want you to pay close attention here because this is information that has been published in some of the most respected neuroscience journals in the world and has still not made its way into routine clinical conversations. I'm talking about specific nutritional compounds that have demonstrated a measurable protective effect on brain tissue, and not in the vague, general way that word superfood tends to get thrown around, but through specific, documented mechanisms at the cellular level. The compound I want to focus on here is something called lion's mane mushroom, and before you dismiss this as alternative medicine, I want to walk you through exactly what the peer-reviewed literature actually shows. Lion's mane, known scientifically as Hericium erinaceus, contains two unique families of compounds called hericenones and erinacines. These compounds have been shown across multiple studies to stimulate the production of a protein called nerve growth factor, or NGF. NGF is precisely what its name suggests. It is a protein your brain produces that promotes the growth, maintenance, and survival of neurons. Your brain produces less of it as you age, and reduced NGF is associated with accelerated cognitive decline and increased vulnerability to neurodegenerative disease. This is not a peripheral finding. This is a central mechanism. A randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial published in the journal Phytotherapy Research, considered the gold standard of clinical research design, found that adults over 50 who took lion's mane daily for 16 weeks showed significantly improved scores on cognitive function scales compared to those who received a placebo. And when they stopped taking it, the improvements faded. That reversibility is actually important. It tells us the effect is real, and it is active, not a statistical artifact. Separate research from the University of Queensland identified that the active compounds in lion's mane also promote a process called remyelination, the repair of the myelin sheath that insulates your nerve fibers. When myelin degrades, neural signals slow down. That slowing is experienced as the mental fog, the word retrieval delays, the processing lag that so many people over 60 normalize as just getting older. Remyelination means the insulation is being repaired. The signals move faster. I had a patient, a 68-year-old woman named Patricia from Portland, Oregon, a former high school principal who had noticed a progressive slowing in her processing speed over about 3 years. She was not dramatically impaired, but she felt the difference keenly. She was a precise person, and imprecision in her own mind distressed her deeply. We introduced lion's mane as part of a broader protocol, and at her 3-month follow-up, she described something specific that I found clinically meaningful. She said the feeling of reaching for a word and finding a wall was happening less. She could not quantify it, but she felt cleaner in her thinking. Her follow-up cognitive assessments reflected objective improvement. Her synergy tip here is to pair lion's mane with omega-3 rich foods, specifically fatty fish like wild salmon or sardines, because DHA, the omega-3 fatty acid most concentrated in brain tissue, works alongside nerve growth factor to support neuronal membrane integrity. The two together create a more favorable environment for the growth and protection of neurons than either does in isolation. Number 2 brings us to something that has been studied for over 40 years, that has over 3,000 peer-reviewed publications behind it, and that an extraordinary number of people over 60 are still not doing in a way that activates its most powerful brain protective effects. I'm talking about aerobic exercise, but specifically what neuroscientists now call BDNF activating exercise, and the distinction matters more than most people realize. BDNF stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. If nerve growth factor is the protein that tends to neurons like a gardener, then BDNF is the fertilizer. It is sometimes described by neuroscientists as miracle grow for the brain. It promotes the survival of existing neurons, encourages the growth of new ones through a process called neurogenesis, and strengthens the synaptic connections between them. BDNF is the molecular mechanism behind learning, memory, and cognitive resilience, and its production drops significantly with age. By 65, most adults are producing meaningfully less BDNF than they were at 45. That decline is not fixed, it is reversible, and the single most powerful trigger for BDNF production that we have identified is sustained moderate intensity aerobic exercise. A landmark study from the University of Illinois found that adults over 60 who engaged in regular aerobic exercise for 1 year showed a 2% increase in hippocampal volume. Now that sounds modest until you understand the context. The hippocampus normally shrinks by 1 to 2% per year in aging adults. These participants didn't just slow the shrinkage, they reversed it. They grew brain tissue that was otherwise scheduled for loss. Research published in the journal Neuroimage confirmed that the mechanism was BDNF dependent, meaning the hippocampal growth was directly tied to the exercise-induced increase in this critical protein. The specific parameters matter. For BDNF activation, you need sustained aerobic effort, meaning your heart rate elevated for a minimum of 20 continuous minutes, at moderate intensity, meaning you can speak but would find singing difficult. This threshold is what consistently triggers significant BDNF release. Below it, the effect is minimal. Above it, particularly for older adults, the benefit does not increase proportionally and the injury risk does. 20 to 40 minutes, 5 days a week, at that moderate conversational pace. Walking qualifies. Swimming qualifies. Cycling qualifies. The activity matters far less than the consistency and the duration. I want to tell you about a patient I think about often. His name was Harold, a 70-year-old retired accountant from Phoenix, Arizona. He came to me after a neuropsychologist had flagged him for mild cognitive impairment, the clinical category between normal aging and dementia. He was frightened. His wife was frightened. He had not exercised in any meaningful way for over a decade. We built a walking protocol together, 25 minutes, 5 mornings a week, moderate pace. Just that, to start. At his 6-month cognitive reassessment, his scores had improved enough that the mild cognitive impairment designation was removed. His neuropsychologist told him it was one of the more remarkable reversals she had seen in her practice. Harold told me later that the walks had become the part of his day he protected most fiercely, not because he had to, because he could feel the difference. And now we arrive at number 1, the single most powerful brain protector I have encountered in over 20 years of functional medicine practice. The one that, when I explain the mechanism to patients, most often produces genuine silence in the room, because it reframes something most people have spent their whole lives treating as a passive inconvenience, something they've cut short, pushed aside, traded away for productivity. I'm talking about sleep, but not simply sleep. I'm talking about what neuroscientists at the University of Rochester, in research published in the journal Science in 2013, discovered to be one of the most consequential biological processes in the entire human body, a system so important, so fundamental to brain health, that its disruption is now directly implicated in the development of Alzheimer's disease, a system called the glymphatic system. Here's what happens while you sleep, specifically during the deep, slow-wave stages of sleep that dominate the early part of the night. Your brain physically changes its structure. The space between your brain cells expands by up to 60%, and through that expanded space, cerebrospinal fluid begins to flow in a pulsing rhythmic current driven by the beating of arteries in the brain. That fluid acts like a pressure washer, flushing out the metabolic waste products that have accumulated in your brain tissue throughout the day. Among the most critical waste products cleared by this system is amyloid beta, the protein that forms the plaques directly associated with Alzheimer's disease. Your brain produces amyloid beta constantly as a normal byproduct of neural activity. The glymphatic system operating during deep sleep is the primary mechanism for removing it. When you sleep poorly, when you cut your sleep short, when the deep stages are fragmented or insufficient, that clearance is incomplete. Amyloid accumulates. Over years, over decades, the plaques form, the damage begins. Research published in the journal Nature Communications found that even a single night of sleep deprivation resulted in a significant increase in amyloid beta accumulation in the human brain detectable by PET scan, a single night. The implications for people who have been chronically undersleeping for years are, to speak plainly, deeply serious. And the aging-specific tragedy here is that deep sleep naturally decreases with age. By 65, many adults are getting significantly less slow-wave sleep than they did in their 40s. Not because they need less, they still need just as much, but because the brain's architecture for generating it becomes less efficient over time. This means that protecting sleep quality in older adults is not a luxury. It is, by any meaningful measure of the evidence, the most important thing you can do for your brain. I think of a patient named Eleanor, 72 years old, a retired nurse from Scottsdale, Arizona, who had been sleeping 5 to 6 hours a night for most of her adult life. She wore the short sleep almost as a badge. She had always been busy, always had more to do than hours allowed. When she came to me, her cognitive complaints were significant enough that her daughter had encouraged her to seek evaluation. We ran her inflammatory markers. We discussed the glymphatic system at length. Something shifted in her understanding during that conversation. She later told me it was the first time she had ever thought of sleep as medicine rather than surrender. We built what I call a sleep recalibration protocol together, a consistent bedtime of 10 o'clock, a wake time of 6. Her bedroom made completely dark, every light source covered or removed. Her room temperature brought down to 67 degrees Fahrenheit because core body temperature must drop for deep sleep stages to initiate, and cooler environments accelerate that drop. All screens removed 90 minutes before bed, not because of habit, but because the blue wavelength light emitted by screens suppresses melatonin production in a way that specifically delays and shortens deep sleep stages. And 2 teaspoons of tart cherry juice concentrate in a small amount of water at 8 o'clock each evening because tart cherries are one of the few whole foods with a naturally meaningful concentration of melatonin precursors, confirmed in research published in the European Journal of Nutrition. Within 6 weeks, Eleanor was sleeping 7.5 hours consistently. Within 3 months, her cognitive complaints had reduced significantly. Her daughter called the change remarkable. Eleanor told me she felt, for the first time in perhaps 30 years, like her brain was actually rested, and the research supports exactly what she was experiencing. A 20-year cohort study from the University of California, San Diego found that adults over 60 who consistently achieved 7 to 8.5 hours of quality sleep had Alzheimer's-related biomarker profiles measurably more favorable than those sleeping 6 hours or fewer. Sleep is not the background of your life. It is the maintenance window during which your brain decides whether to accumulate damage or clear it. Every night is an opportunity that, once passed, cannot be reclaimed. Your synergy tip for number 1 is perhaps the most important pairing in this entire video. Combine your sleep optimization with the aerobic exercise from number 2. Morning exercise, specifically outdoor morning exercise in natural light, does 2 things simultaneously that compound in a way no supplement can replicate. It triggers a significant BDNF release that protects your neurons through the day, and the morning light exposure anchors your circadian rhythm, which is the biological clock that governs when your brain initiates deep sleep stages at night. The circadian system is exquisitely light sensitive. Morning sunlight within the first hour of waking sends a timing signal to your suprachiasmatic nucleus, the brain's master clock, that sets the entire sleep-wake architecture for the coming night. People who receive consistent morning light exposure fall into deep sleep faster, stay in it longer, and wake feeling more genuinely restored. These 5 protectors, social connection, novelty learning, lion's mane and omega-3 nutrition, BDNF activating aerobic exercise, and restorative glymphatic sleep, are not a protocol I invented. They are what the accumulated body of peer-reviewed neuroscience, reviewed honestly, and applied clinically, consistently points toward. They are not exotic. They are not expensive. What they are is undercommunicated, underprioritized, and available to you starting today. I have watched patients in their mid-70s improve cognitive function that their families had quietly accepted as permanent loss. I have seen mild cognitive impairment designations removed. I have watched the lights come back on in people who feared they were going dark. And in every single case, the foundation was not a drug. It was understanding followed by consistent action. You are not a passive observer of what happens to your brain. You are its primary caretaker. And now you have information that most people, including many physicians, have never taken the time to synthesize and share. Use it. Share it with someone you love. And leave me a comment right now telling me your age and which of these 5 protectors you are committing to first. I read every one. I will see you in the next video. Your brain is worth fighting for.